What them haters talking about?
What's up, family? Phil Scott from The Advice Show in Houston and Dr. Mumbi from Nairobi teamed up to bring you one of the most important videos you'll ever watch. In the video, Dr. Mumbi, God bless this woman, she exposes the covert plan to keep blacks in America and blacks in Africa apart. The reason being is because the powers that be, the evil people of this world, they feel like they can control black people better if black people are divided. Specifically, black people in Africa and in America. And she perfectly lays out the plan, exposes it, gives a perfect illustration on the effects of their plan and the method. It's beautiful, man. Y'all check it out. Hey, Phil, man, salute for this video. This is one of your best videos, man. Salute. Y'all make sure y'all follow Phil also, The Advice Show on YouTube. But man, this is one of the best videos he's ever put out. This is one of the best videos on YouTube, period. It was so good that I had to hit him up and say, hey man, let me check this out. Let me put this on my channel. So he allowed me to repost it. Thank you for that, man. Leave your comments, and if you haven't done so already, follow The Advice Show TV and the Dr. Mumbi Show on YouTube. These people are soldiers. They deserve your support. No more talk.
Wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up. Wake up, Africa.
Hello and welcome to a special production of the Dr. Mumbi Show. Dr. Mumbi Saraki on The Advice Show. Yeah, guys, we're doing a collaboration. And between Kenya and Houston, or Nairobi and Houston, I'm reporting directly from Nairobi for The Advice Show, looking at, the relationship between Africans on the continent and Africans in the US and around the world. How can we create more synergies together? How can we, partner more? And I'm really praying that this collaboration will grow into many, many different kinds of bridges between Africa and the US, particularly, economic bridges, travel bridges, and, the reunification of the African people around the world, because the time has come. And, this week I really wanted to focus as the first episode on why is there such a huge disconnect between Africans on the continent of Africa and Africans in America? Why is there there's almost even a hostility between us? There's, we don't know much about each other. We don't feel like we're really connected. And as I was doing my research into this, I found out that it is something that has been systematically and covertly done. It is not that we grew apart, or, Africans in Africa sold Africans in America, and, and we just hate each other and all that. No. This is something that our colonizers and our former oppressors put in place. And they have been orchestrating the perpetual division of Africans in the diaspora and Africans in Africa. I keep wanting to say Kenya because that's where I am, for over 50 years. And I think that if we become aware of some of the tactics they've used to keep us separate, then we can understand where, the power really lies in us coming together. And first of all, there's two main ways that this has been done. The first main way is by mainstream media, which I'm going to get into right now. And then the second way is there was actually a covert US foreign policy document. And a lot of people say the document is fake. The government has denied it. In fact, President Carter, who was in office when it was written, denied of its existence. The author of the document said it was, fabricated. But when you look through the document, And when you look through some of the tenets and some of the strategies that they put in place, not only to keep Africa and Africans in America separate, but also to disintegrate and kind of disempower any kind of movements among the African Americans and any kind of movements among the Africans. Yo, it doesn't seem like fiction. It actually looks like playbook what they've used and implemented over the years. Now, one thing that mainstream media has done, and to keep the hostility and division between Africans on the continent and Africans in America, is there has always been a systematic approach by Western media where American journalists only cover Africa's outbreaks of disease, they only cover our wars, they only cover our disasters, they only cover the violence on the continent, while overlooking the region's many political and economic success stories. You also only see images of like the mud huts, and I actually got a message from someone, stay in your mud hut. And I'm like, really? Like, you think we're out here like living in mud huts? Maybe a very small fraction, but you only see our mud huts. You only see our war-torn areas. You only see like the dead bodies of Africans, as a result of civil war, etc. But you never see the magnificent cities like Nairobi. You never see the magnificent cities in Nigeria. You never see the superhighways, in Kenya, in South Africa, in West Africa. And it's just like, I always say that Africa really looks a lot like the US, where you have the big cities, and you have the big cities across the African continent, and then the rest of middle America is just, it's not all high rises, etc., etc. And as you can see from some of these images, Africa is totally not what you've been lied to about. Now, another thing is, there's always been an agenda to promote the white savior industrial complex. And so what you get is a lot of, there's like a covert foreign policy that promotes a certain image of like Africa needing aid, Africa starving, Africa in conflict, where we're constantly being fed this, not just locally, but even internationally. Because one thing I've realized is it's not that, the middle Caucasians and the lower level Caucasians may not know the covert agenda of their governments and of the white supremacist leadership to kind of keep Africa poor and exploited. Because, when we're poor, when we can't get our act together, they can get our gold, they can have access to our minerals, they can have access to our, irons and our mines and our oil without much of a fight, and for almost a fraction of the price they would get if they would get it for if we were actually together as a nation and as a continent. And so you'll see that even in the minds of a lot of Westerners, and there's a lot of polls that have been done, they actually buy into this whole thing of Africa can't get it together and we need the West to help us to, we need the West to come in and give us books. We need the West to come in and build our schools. We need the West to come in and build our hospitals. When the truth is that there is a much bigger picture, there's a much bigger covert operation that is actually, helping to assassinating our liberation leaders, putting in place puppet leaders, keeping most of Africa poor by having these huge debt policies where we have been paying debt to our former colonizer from the day we were independent. So they've never taken their fingers, their dirty hands off our land. They've never taken them off our politics. And so what you see is all of this creates, a lot of misinformation, a lot of stereotyping, a lot of validation of white privilege. This idea, especially if you see a lot of the ads by like the International Red Cross, etc., where, it's like, give us, help us to send a goat to a lady in the village in Africa, help us to send to buy school books and textbooks. But there was actually a poll done, I think it was by the Washington Post, that showed that a lot of Caucasians, a lot of the white supremacists are super happy to when they're told they're aiding in providing mosquito nets, they're aiding in providing food, they're aiding in healthcare. They were very happy to donate to that. But when they were told, donate cash so that the African governments and the African people can choose what to do with that money, the amount of donations given fell significantly, which shows you that it's a white savior complex where I'm happy to provide you with a table, a desk for your school. I'm happy to provide you with a mosquito net for your bed so you don't get bitten. But I don't want to empower you. I don't want to give you $10 to empower your life or $100 to empower your life. No. So there's always a system of control. And the sad thing is that this also creates a fear of foreigners and immigrants. It creates a fear of Africans. And it also creates a problem with, foreign policy, a distorted and mishandled foreign policy intervention, because a lot of Western governments, a lot of these governments in Europe and the US have a very paternalistic attitude towards Africa, where, the meaning of paternalistic, what this paternalistic attitude comes from, comes out as, is like an authoritative but benevolent relationship, of parents to their children. That's basically how Africa is treated. And so Africans are seen as needing guidance since children are unable to act properly or on their own or do anything. And so you guys, you know what happens in Africa? A lot of times, the most active players, the foreign ambassadors actually have a voice. They hold regular press conferences where they talk about, needing to help the land. They'll open schools here. Have you ever heard of an African diplomat in the US coming and opening a school in a neighborhood? Have you ever heard of them coming and donating a hospital in the neighborhood? Would they even be allowed to? We see a lot of Caucasian ambassadors, and you can see it here in Kenya, where they'll tell our governments, they'll actually be lecturing our governments like they're the father and we're the children. And this has been going on for decades, and people even find it normal. But they'll hold regular press conferences and they'll be like, oh no, you got to stop corruption in your nation. Oh no, you need to stop your leaders from doing A, B, C, D. Whereas, do you think an African diplomat could actually come to the US and say, we have a problem with Trump, or we have a problem with Obama's policy, or we have a problem with the number of men being killed on the streets? Of course not. And you can see here, the Irish ambassador recently went and opened a school in a rural area. His car got stuck in the mud, so he was put in you see here, in a carriage with cows, etc. And you can see this white savior complex. This is what our children in Africa are seeing. This white man coming and giving us a school and opening it and hugging our children. Whereas here in Kenya, we have a budget that is being eaten by our corrupt leaders. But we should not be allowing white people to come into our nation and build things that we are actually being taxed to build. It keeps us in this perpetual, slavery, perpetual mental slavery, where even our children are being subconsciously fed that the only person who can save them is a white man. It is sickening and disgusting. And this is probably why for so long you've thought, Africa can't get it together. Well, look at these beautiful cities in Africa. Look at our wildlife. Look at our beaches. And when we get back, I'll be talking about the actual covert system, the covert foreign policy that the US has had in place since the 70s to keep Africans on the continent and Africans in the US separate, divided, and conquered. We'll be right back.
Wake up, 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 wake up. Wake up, Africa, your time has come. Open up your eyes and see the sun. Open up your spirit and let God in.
The chosen. Wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up. Wake up, Africa.
Welcome back to Dr. Mumbi on The Advice Show. And this is a collaboration between the Dr. Mumbi Show and The Advice Show. Our first connection between Nairobi and Houston. Trying to reconnect our people, trying to break those barriers, those artificial barriers that have been, keeping us divided. And as we keep divided, we remain conquered. You must ask yourself, why has there been such a systematic, in fact, a U.S. foreign policy to keep Africans on the continent separate from Africans in the United States? And there's this document, I told you guys, people say it's fake, people say, whatever, but there was a document that was written, and it's actually called, it was a national security. Let me just look for the title of that. National Security Council Memo number 46 that was written in 1978. Of course, the U.S. government, totally denies it, but it outlines a historic plan to keep Africans and African Americans separate. Now, the main actors were the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and the Director of the CIA. And it outlines a 30-year-old agenda that kept Africans ignorant of African Americans, of the plight of African Americans. We only see, until today, we only see, your hip hop videos. We only see, young black men being crucified on the streets, and we're just wondering what is going on, but we were completely disconnected from, the John Henrik Clarks, the Dr. Amos Wilsons, the Malcolm X's, the W.E.B. Du Bois, the Frederick Douglasses, etc. We never heard from the real, African American thinkers and liberators and revolutionaries. No, there was like a blanket veil over that. But there was also a very covert effort to keep African Americans ignorant of African leaders and African liberators, and our freedom fighters like Kwame Nkrumah, Sankara, Tom Mboya. I can go on and on and on, and I will actually be highlighting them in future episodes. But they were quick to tell you about Nelson Mandela, the fake hero, who persevered in prison for 21 or 27 years and then came out and gave the white oppressor. Oh, they're quick to share that with you, fake. And it's always promoting this thing of fake tolerance, But actually, the second thing they did, apart from keeping Africans ignorant of African Americans and vice versa, they kept our leaders. This foreign policy actually had a clause where it was like, keep African and African American leaders separate by preventing any contact, by preventing collaboration at all costs. That's what they said. Prevent collaboration at all costs. So what they did is they targeted African leaders and leftist African American leaders, spied on them, bugged them, and made sure that they never connected, make sure that they never collaborated. They also inhibited any pressure and contact by African leaders with the U.S. black communities. And the reason they did this is because we both have different powers that if we came together, we could really shift things globally and within our own countries. Number one, Africa has a third of the United Nations bloc, which means that if they were to unite and if they were to collaborate with African American leaders and really be aware of the race relations and the apartheid system in the U.S., which is literally what it is, how Africans are treated in the U.S. If they were to be able to unite and actually get information on this, they could pressure the United Nations to bring sanctions against the United States. They could actually create a lot of pressure for the U.S. to change their policy towards the African Americans in their own land. And so that's why they always kept those leaders separate, so that and they also did a lot to keep Africans within Africa separate, keep the nation separate, the French speaking, the English speaking, all of these divisions, artificial borders that our leaders decided to keep, but those are stories for other days. Now on another level is that there's a huge US foreign policy, and actually this document in 1978 was done in order to maintain maintain support for apartheid South Africa. That's why this whole document was put together, and they wanted to keep the Africans and the African Americans separate. And one of the reasons they wanted to keep the African Americans ignorant of what was happening in Africa is because you guys could easily form a lobby group, a powerful black lobby group that could come together and that could pressure, Washington to change the foreign policy against, the South Africans, against and stop supporting the white supremacist system in South Africa. So you see, we have our strengths, whereas on the one hand, the African nations could actually come together and put pressure as a continent, as a united African Union, or at the United Nations level, and even just globally against the racist and discriminatory system of the US. The US, the African Americans in the United States could also come together and put pressure on some of the foreign policy decisions and the mismanagement of foreign policy towards Africa. You could, put pressure for less interference, put pressure for less paternalistic behavior, etc., etc. Now, so apart from preventing black African states from, assuming a negative and hostile attitude to U.S. national interests, particularly in relation to apartheid South Africa, they also, prevented any radical and fundamental political change that would deprive the U.S. of Africa's natural resources. And so what they said is there was a covert effort using the CIA, using military intelligence to maintain the status quo in Africa. And what the status quo was, the tribal and regional discord, the artificial barriers. So a lot of our presidents, a lot of the initial presidents of the African nations after independence, the ones who were truly Pan-Africanists were taken out, they were killed. And what we got is a lot of puppet presidents. And what they did is they decided to maintain these artificial lines because they said, oh, it will be too much work for us to remove, the lines and now try and figure out who is who. And, some of these lines, these artificial borders cut communities, cut nations in half. I hate calling them tribes because they're not really tribes. And, another thing they worked very hard to do was to maintain economic backwardness, to maintain an inadequate infrastructure, to, sustain, the problems like, drought, famine, where we could really not help ourselves. And I could go on and on and on. And there is so much that has been done to maintain this divided attitude, and I guess next week I'll continue with this, and I'll go into some of the recommendations that were made that inhibited coordinated activity between the black movement in the US and the Africa Liberation Movement on the continent, which would have made us invincible. I'll also talk about the special clandestine operations by the CIA, which literally created mistrust and hostility between black America and black Africa. There were programs in place. That's why, a lot of African Americans in Africa have a resentment towards, black Africa. It has been done. It is a brainwashing activity that has been in place for at least 50 years, generate hostility in the world against, black America and also against black Africa, promote this idea that we can't get it together and we can't help ourselves. I'll also get into how, the support of the American support, the white supremacist American support of apartheid South Africa really triggered like a racist foreign policy against the rest of Africa. And so we've never been allowed to get our act together. We've never been allowed to get strong, to sort ourselves out. But the time has come. The time has come. And, the reason I share all this information is because we must start reversing some of these covert the covert agenda to keep us separate. And the way we can do that is I encourage as many African Americans to hop on a plane and come and visit Africa, visit Ghana, visit Kenya, visit Ethiopia, visit South Africa. And there's so many other nations, Senegal, Ivory Coast, Tanzania, Uganda. There's so many nations. Hop on a plane, come for a week. That will completely change. It will be a paradigm shift for you mentally. I also, encourage that for those of you who are in a position to, for the leadership to start connecting with some of the Pan-African leaders that are emerging. And we must start to educate ourselves. And this is one of the platforms. We're so grateful to Phil and the Advice Show for having us on here to start breaking these barriers and we must start connecting. We must start connecting our leaders. We must start connecting our businesses. And we must start to build that bridge that they have never allowed us to build. And I'm seeing in the future the possibility of having conferences. I know Phil and his team are heading to Ethiopia for one of the major festivals in August, etc. So we must start to build those bridges, economic bridges, political bridges, and it is our generation that must do it. God bless you. God bless your family. God bless the African nation around the world, because the time has come for the great reunification of our nation.
Open up your spirit.
Wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up.
What the haters talking about?